Hi, I'm Damali Peterman with Breakthrough ADR, and I'm so excited to be here today with a friend of Breakthrough ADR that we've had on the show before, Dr. Dana Fisher. Dana, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me again, Damali.
Well, I mean, I could think of no one better to have at a time like this. Today's date is June 10th, 2020. And, so much has transpired over the past, 2 or 3 months that I think really make the work that you do. I mean, it's always been vital, but I feel like the timing of what's going on in the world today make the work that you do just important for everyone everywhere to know about, especially in the United States. And so I would love for you to just, for those people who haven't had a chance to read about you and, the Washington Post, the Huff Post, or to pick up one of your books or know about your work, I want you to just give a brief introduction and tell us about yourself. Tell us about you.
Okay, well, I'm a sociologist. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland. I do research that spans a number of different issues, but all of it is about understanding democracy. I'm particularly focused on activism, civic participation, and I study protest. And a lot of my work has been focusing on protest recently. In fact, since the protests broke out, I have been out in the crowd surveying protesters, which is one of the things that I've done a bunch. I did it for my last book, American Resistance, where I started in the streets with people at the Women's March 2017 and went from there. So I went back into the streets of Washington, D.C. last week with the research team to start looking at who's out there and what they're protesting once again.
Excellent. And I feel like, especially thinking about protests and activism and what's happening that triggered the most recent protests. And I know that everyone probably knows about it right now in the moment, but because these videos last for a long time, I just want to take a moment to talk about a series of events that occurred that led to the most recent protests. Which, you can figure out how far back we want to go, but at least within the last few weeks, we heard about the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and then, the death of George Floyd, which occurred in Minnesota. He was arrested for being a suspect of forgery, and then, as everyone watched on what happened on camera, not even 9 minutes later, his life was taken from him at the hands of the police department, and in particular, a police officer who was kneeling on his neck. And the audio you can hear him saying that he can't breathe. You can hear his bystanders saying he can't breathe. And it was just a very tragic situation, which really shone a light on racial injustice and systemic inequality and even economic disparity in the United States. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Dana.
No, I mean, I think that one of the things that I've written about is that the fact that George Floyd died on camera, where social media distributed these really horrifying videos of what happened and how it was clear that he couldn't breathe and still the police didn't get off, I think has really been, a spark for getting people to start paying attention to racial inequality in our country in a way that we haven't seen before.
It's so
the
true.
only other thing I think maybe it's worth just saying also that this all comes on the heels of the fact that we've been locked up. I mean, we've all been under stay-at-home orders. I mean, we're still under stay-at-home orders here in Maryland. And as a result, not only are people, in their houses, most of their normal lives have been shortened. Children are home from school, so we're homeschooling here. And I'm a university professor. All of my students went home, and most of them were taking classes from their parents' basements. So there's a lot of anxiety around that, and associated with that, of course, is the cratering of the American economy, where I think they're now saying that already jobs numbers and economic numbers are worse than they were during the Great Depression, or at least at no time except for the Depression have we seen numbers so bad. So there's a lot of anxiety swirling around right now, and that happened prior to watching, a man be murdered on social media.
Exactly. And I feel like that was just sort of the catalyst of so many things, because you have people who are still under the stay-at-home order. Um, you also have some economies that have opened up a little bit. So here in the United States, because we have viewers who are all over the world, you have some states that are open and are, not completely open, almost completely open, like in Texas and in Florida, whereas here more on the northeastern part of the US, in Maryland where you are, in New York where I am, we're just in New York, we're in phase one that just started 3 days ago, 4 days ago or so. And so I think that anxiety that you're talking about is also exacerbated by the fact that, you mentioned the jobs numbers and, the unemployment. There are a lot of people who are at home. There are a lot of people who, are unemployed, and there are a lot of people who have time, and they want to think, they want to do something with that time. And so I think the timing of this, and the collective outrage that you've seen and that we've all seen, not only in the US but across the world, because then what I've seen in the media as well is also people saying, we don't treat certain, races equally in this country, or we don't do things, it's not just a US problem. I think it's something that we're seeing and that you talk about in general, in your book, about resistance and the way that resistance movements work and how they're grassroots, organizations, that they start at homes and, walking from door to door, to collect people and to get them on board, makes me think about, like, right now, would you classify what's happening with the protests as a form of resistance? And if so, do you see any impact on upcoming US elections?
Well, I absolutely see what we're seeing in the streets right now is absolutely a resistance. In terms of the way that I define the resistance in my book, I talk about it as a counter movement against the Trump administration and its policies. And I talk about how, because it's a counter movement, we see a lot of strains of earlier resistance, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement, the climate justice movement, the women's movement, all working together and coming together because they're unified against this common enemy. And, even if originally, when we saw what happened to George Floyd and the other people who died recently, if that didn't start out as resistance to the Trump administration, there's no question that President Trump and his administration basically joined the factions that people were resisting, particularly when Donald Trump pushed to militarize the police, call up the National Guard, send tear gas and rubber bullets into peaceful protesters, areas where people were peacefully protesting, particularly so he could walk over and do a photo op last week. All of these things, first of all, upset people who were already in the streets, but more importantly, this collective outrage grew. And so many other people came out in response to it because they wanted to resist this kind of movement against, democracy in America. In a lot of ways, we see that now. And I think that brings us to your question about the upcoming election. And I know that there are numbers that are not very flattering to the president and his prospects, although he said he's going to go back to having rallies, which hopefully people will wear masks to. But at the same time, I think that what this shows us is that, as I talk about in the book, after the 2016 election, a lot of people who believed in the political process in America woke up and realized that they had to do more than sit on their couches and watch CNN. And I document that starting at the Women's March, where, a third of all the people in the streets actually report never participating in a protest before, not being particularly politically active. But these people, they woke up and they're staying woke. And what I think is really interesting about this is, as you know, I surveyed the crowds at all of these marches, starting with the Women's March, but going through all the other big marches that happened, the March for Racial Justice, the People's Climate March, the March for Science, the March for Our Lives, all these other big marches that have happened since the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017. And at all of those, I asked people what motivated them to participate. And we've seen consistently that people are coming out partially for and motivated by issues of racial justice and police brutality / Black Lives Matter. And so what we see now with the people who are in the streets is that that's the number one thing that's motivating people, but they're also protesting Donald Trump. And we see people coming in who are coming in perhaps because they're resisting the Trump administration, and they care a lot about these issues. So we see this nice pattern of people who cross a bunch of intersectional lines in terms of what's motivating them. And whether or not that will lead to successes at the polls really obviously stands to be seen, because November is still a long way away, especially in these days. But at the same time, what we know for sure is that these people are caring a lot and paying attention a lot, and they're coming out in solidarity with brothers and sisters in the street. And I think that that tells us a lot about how much it will matter, because it will matter for them in the election. It will matter for them in local elections, not just the national election. And it also matters as we see some local cities and communities and states even changing their policies with regard to how they're treating the police. And, as there's this, increased cry to defund the police, for example.
Interesting. And so, one of the things that what I hear you saying is that people mobilizing and to protest and to resist a variety of different things, and a lot, the intersectionality of different movements, bringing people together to resist a common enemy. And, I think you mentioned the enemy being Donald Trump, but we can also say sort of like we're in a situation where it's sort of an us versus them period of time. And my understanding of conflict and the way that conflict works, especially when, the ability to use your executive function is momentarily suspended. So you're unable to sort of make that calm, cool decision because you're in conflict, and you go to that more reptilian survival of the fittest type of, response, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And so right now we're more engaged in that fight. And we've heard and we know that some people are also responding to this in more of a freeze, that they don't know what to do, or they're thinking about what to do, or flight. People are leaving. People are leaving. I know people who are leaving New York City, who are leaving to go to the West Coast or other countries right now. And for the people who are engaged in the fight, what I hear you say is that it's a little bit too soon to know what's going to happen. I mean, it's the beginning of June. The elections are the beginning of November. But a question that keeps coming up for me and for others that I've spoken with is, will the people who are mobilizing to fight right now, and I'll tell you what my answer is in a second, will those people will they go out to vote? And my answer is, if people are willing to go out and protest in groves during, coronavirus, it didn't disappear, right? Like, it didn't just walk away because we are protesting right now. To me, if they're willing to risk, coronavirus and the threat of coronavirus to mobilize, to protest, then those same people will vote.
Yeah, I mean, I can actually add some data to that. I mean, so absolutely, yes. I think that the fact that people are going out even with the coronavirus is a good indication. The fact that people are going out during the summertime when they're wearing masks, and I haven't talked to one person who likes wearing a mask ever. And I have to say that going out last week when I was out in the streets with the protesters, it felt like 97 degrees here in Washington, D.C. Wearing a mask was no fun, but people were there nonetheless, and they were wearing masks anyway, trying to stay safe. And I think that, and the other thing I would just say is, so one of the things we asked people in the crowd, and we surveyed last Thursday and then surveyed people in the streets in Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, and also in London over the weekend. And we asked people if in the past year they had voted. And more than half of the people in almost every location had voted in the past year, which means they voted in a primary. Mm-hmm. So people who vote in primaries vote in the national elections unless they do not support the candidates. So the next question we asked is, who, if the election were held tomorrow, no matter whether you're eligible to vote or not, who would you vote for? To get a sense of if people are supporting the candidates who are on the ballot. And so we had, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and then it said neither of these two, with the idea being that people might support a third party candidate whom we don't know yet. Not, every single respondent in my survey checked off the box for Joe Biden. Wow. So these are not people who, there was a lot of talk about these never Biden people. I can tell you the never Biden people are not in the streets during these protests. I'm not sure if they exist anymore, but these people have voted and they're supporting Biden. So unless something big happens in the meantime, and lots of things will certainly happen between now and November, they will be out back at the, in the voting booth voting in November 2020. The biggest challenge, I think, is that we have fair elections. And
Yes.
I'm sure, you know, if I talk to people on the streets, a lot of them even mentioned it when they're taking this survey, going, well, you know, I mean, and that was before we saw these horrible images of people standing for hours and hours in Georgia yesterday. So I would imagine that that's the big challenge here, is making sure that everybody's voices, you know, their votes are counted, their voices are heard. And that's where we need to make sure that there are lots of groups that are out there trying really hard to make sure that that's possible. I know Michelle Obama has a wonderful initiative right now around this, but it's because it's so important. Stacey Abrams also does. I mean, there's so many big initiatives to try to help. In fact, Stacey Abrams initiated hers because of the ways that votes were suppressed in Georgia when she was running for governor during 2018. So we need to be paying a lot of attention to that, because the people who care so much about having their voices heard need to make sure that their votes count.
That's right. That's right. And what I love about your book, which I have to show it here for the plug because it's such a great book. And, you know, to me, I'm so happy it was released. I think it's so timely. It will continue to be timely, because even though you start by talking about the Women's March, every time there's a movement, there's so many jewels in your book that can really provide guidance to anyone who's interested in resisting. And so what are some things that people can do right now if they want to, what if they're in the freeze mode of responding to what they perceive as a conflict, and now they're starting to defrost, if you will, and they want to get involved? What are some things that they can do to resist?
Well, one of the things that people can do to resist is they can educate themselves, particularly people, I mean, like, for example, right now we know that people who are in the streets are relatively young. Makes a lot of sense because, number one, people who are young are out of school and have been locked at home, as I said before, you know, probably in their parents' basements quite a bit. So they're just dying to get out. But in addition to that, we know young people are less at risk for being really harmed by COVID-19. So it makes a lot of sense that the older people are a little afraid of getting into a crowd. So if you're older and you want to resist, there are lots of ways to do it that don't involve putting you at risk regarding your health, or anybody who's worried about their health for that matter. Pay attention, get educated, and start to get involved with many organizations that are working to help channel resistance. There are lots of opportunities to get involved in helping with voter registration, voter contact, working with specific campaigns of people whose ideas you believe in, moving towards November 2020. I mean, and one thing that I think is really worth noting here is that because of COVID, a lot of the ways that candidates do their campaigns is not going to be possible. You can't go knocking door to door on strangers' houses right now, and you probably won't be able to do that, you know, all the way through this cycle. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these campaigns are looking for volunteers who want to help with either, you know, getting initiatives done and contacting people in more, you know, less traditional ways or in new ways, right? And there's some really interesting opportunities to use technology here. So people need to be paying attention, but I think one of the best things to do is find organizations that can help, because they already have set some of the infrastructure in place that you can use. I do not suggest people try to do it all on their own, because, you know, you may as well take advantage and stand on the shoulders of other people who have come before you and have started to do this work already, because then your resistance means so much more. And as you know, in addition to that, then you're part of a collective. And, you know, that means that your voice gets amplified.
That's great. And so basically not reinventing the wheel, trying to align yourself with organizations that whose missions you believe in and support. If you're older, finding different ways to, you know, to protest, if you will, or to get involved, because going out and walking throughout the streets to protest might not be the best time to do that with COVID-19 still kind of running amok. Using technology, and also what about people who, you know, may not have, you know, time or resources, you know, financially, may not know what organizations to align themselves with? Are there some organizations that come to mind that you would recommend?
Well, I would say if you're really interested in resistance and the election, I mean, one of the best resources, in my opinion, is Indivisible. Move On has done a lot of work. March On, which also has done a lot of work. They actually spun off of the Women's March, so they do a lot of work, and they've been very involved in dealing with gun control, dealing with climate issues, as well as women's rights related issues. I mean, and also if you're specifically focusing and interested in issues of intersectionality and racial justice, the movement for Black Lives is doing really wonderful work. And all of those places, if you go to them, they have lots of resources so that it's not just you have to come out in the streets and put yourself at risk. It's if you want to do something that's super safe and you're limited on time and resources, here is a list. If you want to do something and you have a lot of time but not a lot of resources, you can do this at home and you can do this out with other people. And you get to choose. And so it's, it's a build your own adventure kind of an opportunity here. But I mean, one of the things that that I document in the book and is really beautiful about this moment is that so many organizations emerged to fill what I considered and talk about as a policy void in terms of, an infrastructural void in local levels. So there were not a lot of organizations, or not enough organizations helping to do the work for local peoples and local communities. And we have tons of them now. And the other thing that's really nice about them is they don't, at this point, we don't see a lot of competition among them. They work really well together. And, as Leah Greenberg, who is one of the founders of Indivisible, said to me, they believe really in the, in the bastardized version of the Mao Zedong quote, which is, I don't know if it's Mao's quote. It's a Confucian quote that basically says, it's the many flowers bloom. Can we cut that out?
Yes.
Okay, please cut that out.
I will.
Basically, there are lots of people who follow this idea of many flowers bloom. And the idea being that you can be involved in many different organizations simultaneously and many movements simultaneously as part of your resistance. So you don't have to pick one. It used to be that there was this notion that you really had to like put your flag in, one specific movement and focus there, and you don't have to do that anymore. And I think that's wonderful because we're not, isolated, siloed individuals with siloed interests, which is one of the beautiful things about this notion of intersectionality is that, we have identities that overlap in many different ways, and that may lead us to be motivated to do different things.
That's great, Dana. And I love that because I feel like some people really want to get involved, and as they're trying to figure out what to do, like having the opportunity to, look into Indivisible and march on and Black Lives Matter, I think will be key. What do you think, and I'll end with this question, what do you think about the notion that all lives matter is, kind of the antithesis to Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, so this is a hard question. And I actually was recently criticized on Twitter for making a comment, not about all lives matter, but more making a comment where a Black scholar whom I respect, a Black woman scholar whom I respect a lot, wrote about a disappointing experience that she had, and I responded and I said, unfortunately, that's happened. Happened to a lot of us. It happened to me just last year, and a lot of people jumped on and said that that's not really my place because I'm a white woman of privilege, and I completely understand that, and in a lot of ways, I think that's the same critique that a lot of people are giving to this all lives matter argument. I mean, I think that underneath it all of the people who are pushing for and promoting this idea of Black Lives Matter are not saying that they want to privilege Black lives over other lives, but rather that it's important to heighten this because in a lot of situations, historically and even recently, Black lives are not seen to be equal. And you can see that in the unfortunate death rates at the hands of police that we see all over our country, or if you look at rates of imprisonment, there are just so many different statistics, rates of poverty, less education. I mean, so there are lots of reasons why it's very important to highlight that Black Lives Matter right now. But I think that people need to understand that it's not saying that other people's lives aren't important, but just to focus on this issue so that people maybe are able to internalize it. And one thing that I think is really nice to see in this moment is that we see a real bandwagon effect of a lot of organizations getting involved and supporting this this movement right now. And I'll take one example that I was just shocked at and I laughed at when I saw it originally. So NASCAR actually came out in solidarity and they did a moment and they took a knee 2 days ago. You look a little surprised, Amali. I mean, so it's not the sports you know, the sport where you would expect there to be a lot of solidarity. It's predominantly white and not known for being particularly aware of racial injustices. And it was so amazing to me to see this, because I remember when everybody was up in arms about, you know, football players taking a knee and the president tweeting about it in 2017 and Mike Pence like leaving a football game, et cetera, and so forth. And the idea that now not only do we see like NASCAR joining in solidarity, we see a number of football teams that have now released these very serious statements about this issue. And it's just so amazing to me how much the world has changed so quickly. And all of this is not to say that other lives don't matter, but just to say that we need justice and equality. That's what democracy is all about. And it's about fulfilling, you know, the dream, right?
And what a wonderful way to end this interview. It's about justice and equality. It's another way to fulfill the dream. And that's what democracy is all about.
That is what democracy looks like, to take advantage of the chant that keeps ringing out around across cities, across the United States right now.
I'm so honored to have you here today, Dana. I know that you're very busy. I mean, this is work that you've been doing for a long time. You know, we have American Resistance, which I'm going to include a link for everyone to check it out. It's been kind of like one of my go-to books too, because as you said, that so many movements are connected and related, and you can learn so much from, you know, some of the things that happened in the past that can inform you on what to do today. And so, and not the bad things, but the good things. And actually, no, I mean, to be fair, you can learn a lot about what you don't want to happen again.
I'm sure.
You know, and so I am so honored to have had this conversation with you. I hope that people walk away from this having a sense of, one, that there are people like you out there surveying protesters, collecting data, getting a sense of, you know, what's fueling the resistance, and also providing tangible, you know, resources and recommendations on what you can do if you want to resist. And I do hope that this same fervor and this energy that we're feeling right now in America and beyond does show up in the polls, does show up in November and at the various elections throughout the world, and that people realize that they do have power, and that power is in the vote, among other things. And so thank you for your time, Dana. This is Molly Peterman from Breakthrough ADR, and we will continue to break through, and have a wonderful day.